What would you do if your entire life was on the line? Not just your career, but your honor, your freedom, and everything you've ever fought for. For Sergeant James Carter, that moment came on a quiet Tuesday morning when a single order threatened to destroy everything he believed in. But what he did next would change the course of history and shock the nation. James Carter wasn't just any soldier. With over a decade of service, he was a decorated veteran, known for his unwavering loyalty and unshakable principles. He'd served in some of the most dangerous conflict zones, always putting his team and his country first. But today, he wasn't on the battlefield. He was at Fort Ridgewood, a sprawling military base nestled in the heart of the desert, where the air was thick with tension and the weight of secrets. It started with a summons. Colonel Richard Harris, a high-ranking officer with a reputation for getting results, no matter the cost, had called James into his office. The moment James stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of cigar smoke. Harris sat behind his desk, his cold eyes fixed on James like a predator sizing up its prey. "Carter," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "I have a mission for you, one that requires absolute discretion." James listened as Harris laid out the details. A covert operation targeting a small village in a conflict zone. But something about the mission didn't sit right with him. The targets weren't enemy combatants, they were civilians. Women, children, families. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a mission. It was a test, one that would force him to choose between his duty and his conscience. And the consequences of that choice would ripple far beyond the walls of that office. Little did James know, this decision wouldn't just define his career, it would define his legacy. And as he stood there, staring into the cold eyes of Colonel Harris, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of Colonel Harris's leather chair as he leaned forward. James stood at attention, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd been in high-pressure situations before, firefights, ambushes, life-or-death decisions, but this felt different. This wasn't about survival. It was about morality. Harris slid a folder across the desk, its contents classified and stamped with red ink. "This," he said, tapping the folder with a single finger, "is your mission. A small village in the Al-Mazir region has been identified as a hotbed for insurgent activity. Your team will infiltrate and neutralize the threat." James nodded, his training kicking in. But then Harris added, "The targets are high value, civilians included." James froze. Civilians. He'd signed up to protect the innocent, not harm them. "Sir," he began cautiously, "with all due respect, targeting civilians violates international law. Are we certain they're involved?" Harris's expression darkened. "Carter," he said, his voice sharp, "this isn't a debate. The intelligence is solid. These people are aiding the enemy. They're as guilty as the insurgents themselves." James clenched his fists behind his back, his mind racing. He'd heard rumors about Harris, whispers of missions gone wrong, of corners cut in the name of national security. But this was something else entirely. "Sir," he said, choosing his words carefully, "if there's evidence of their involvement, shouldn't we bring them in for questioning, neutralizing them without due process?" Harris slammed his hand on the desk, cutting James off. "Enough," he barked. "This isn't a courtroom, Carter, it's a war zone. You follow orders or you face the consequences. Do I make myself clear?" James swallowed hard, the weight of Harris's words pressing down on him. He'd always believed in the chain of command, in the importance of discipline and obedience. But this felt wrong. As he left the office, James felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He couldn't shake the image of the village, of families going about their lives, unaware of the danger heading their way. He thought of his own family, of the values they'd instilled in him: integrity, honor, doing what's right, no matter the cost. Back in the barracks, James sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the mission file. His team had been briefed, and the operation was set to begin at dawn. But as he flipped through the pages, his unease only grew. The intelligence was flimsy at best, the evidence circumstantial. Was this really about national security, or was it something darker? That night James barely slept. He replayed the conversation with Harris over and over in his mind, searching for a way out. But every path led to the same conclusion. If he refused, he'd be branded a traitor. If he obeyed, he'd be complicit in something unthinkable. By morning, he knew what he had to do, but he also knew it would cost him everything. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light over Fort Ridgewood. The base was already buzzing with activity, soldiers preparing for the day's missions, their voices sharp and urgent. But for James, the world felt eerily quiet, as if he were moving through a dream. He stood in the briefing room, his team gathered around him, their faces a mix of determination and unease. They'd all seen the mission file. They all knew what was at stake. James took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "Listen up," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This mission, it's not what we signed up for. The targets aren't enemy combatants. They're civilians, women, children, families." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. "I know," James continued, "this goes against everything we've been trained to do. But I can't, I won't, follow an order that violates the very principles we're supposed to protect." The room fell silent. His team exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty to James warring with their fear of the consequences. "What are you saying, Sarge?" asked Private Sarah Mitchell, his closest friend and most trusted ally. "Are you refusing the order?" James met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment no one spoke. Then Sarah nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "I'm with you," she said. One by one the others followed suit, their voices quiet but firm. James felt a surge of gratitude, but it was short-lived. He knew this was just the beginning. Word of James's refusal spread quickly through the base, reaching Colonel Harris within hours. The summons came just after noon, delivered by a stone-faced lieutenant. James walked to Harris's office with a sense of grim determination, his mind racing with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. But he didn't falter. He couldn't. Harris was waiting for him, his expression cold and unreadable. "Carter," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "care to explain why your team hasn't mobilized for the mission?" James stood at attention, his eyes fixed on a point just above Harris's head. "Sir," he said, "I cannot in good conscience carry out an order that targets civilians. It's unethical, it's unlawful, and it's wrong." Harris's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "You think this is about conscience," he snapped. "This is about national security, about protecting our country from those who would destroy it. You don't get to pick and choose which orders you follow, Carter. You're a soldier. You obey." James clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. "With all due respect, sir," he said, "I didn't sign up to be a pawn in someone else's game. I signed up to protect people, and that's what I'm doing." Harris's face turned red with anger. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and venomous. "A court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, is that what you want? To throw away everything you've worked for?" James didn't flinch. "If that's what it takes to sleep at night," he said, "then yes." The meeting ended with Harris storming out, leaving James alone in the office. He felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But he also knew the battle was far from over. Back in the barracks, James found Sarah waiting for him. "How bad was it?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Bad," he admitted, "but I'm not backing down." Sarah nodded, her expression fierce. "Neither am I," she said. "Whatever happens, we're in this together." As the sun set over the base, James sat on his bunk, staring at the mission file. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in days he felt at peace. He'd made his choice, and he was ready to face the consequences. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. James's refusal to carry out the mission had sent shockwaves through the base, and the fallout was swift. Colonel Harris wasted no time in making an example of him. James was stripped of his duties, confined to the barracks, and placed under constant surveillance. Rumors swirled among the soldiers. Some called him a hero, others a traitor. But James didn't care about the rumors. He cared about the truth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat alone in the barracks, staring at his laptop. He'd spent hours poring over the mission file, searching for anything that could prove his suspicions. The evidence was thin: redacted documents, vague reports, and a single name that kept popping up: Blackwater Security, a private military contractor with ties to Harris. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed someone on the outside, someone who could take the story public. That's when he remembered Emily Torres, an investigative journalist who'd made a name for herself exposing corruption in the military. He'd seen her work before, her fearless reporting and unwavering commitment to the truth. If anyone could help him, it was her. Late that night, James made the call. The phone rang twice before a sharp, no-nonsense voice answered. "Emily Torres," she said. James took a deep breath. "Ms. Torres," he began, "my name is Sergeant James Carter. I need your help." He explained the situation in hushed tones, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end. "This is big," Emily said finally. "If what you're saying is true, it could blow the lid off something massive, but it's also dangerous for both of us." James nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know," he said, "but I can't let this go, not when innocent lives are at stake." Emily sighed. "All right," she said, "I'm in, but we need to move fast." Over the next few days, James and Emily worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence. James smuggled documents out of the base, risking court-martial with every page. Emily dug into Blackwater's records, uncovering a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Fort Ridgewood. It was risky, exhausting work, but with each new discovery, James felt a glimmer of hope. Then one evening, Emily called with news. "I've got it," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "A whistleblower from Blackwater. He's willing to talk." James's heart raced. "What did he say?" Emily hesitated. "It's worse than we thought," she said. "Harris wasn't just following orders, he was orchestrating the whole thing. Blackwater been paying him off for years to carry out these missions. They're not about national security, they're about profit." James felt a surge of anger but also relief. This was the proof they needed. "What now?" he asked. "Now," Emily said, "we go public, but you need to be ready. Once this story breaks, there's no going back." James nodded. "I'm ready," he said. The next morning, the story hit the news. Emily's article was everywhere: front-page headlines, breaking news alerts, social media explosions. The details were damning: Harris's ties to Blackwater, the unlawful orders, the civilians caught in the crossfire. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. But so was the backlash. Harris denied everything, calling the article fake news and accusing James of treason. The military launched an investigation, but James knew it was just for show. He was a target now, and the walls were closing in. One night, as James lay in his bunk, he received a text from Emily. "We're not done yet," it read. "There's more to uncover, but we need to be careful. Harris is desperate, and desperate people do desperate things." James stared at the screen, his mind racing. He knew she was right, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. The next morning, James was summoned to the base commander's office. He walked in, his heart pounding, unsure of what to expect. But what he found wasn't an enemy, it was an ally. Captain David Reynolds, a high-ranking officer with a reputation for integrity, was waiting for him. "Carter," Reynolds said, his voice firm but kind, "I've been following your case, and I want you to know you're not alone." James felt a surge of hope. "What happens now?" he asked. Reynolds smiled. "Now," he said, "we fight back." As James left the office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a chance. The truth was out there, and he was ready to fight for it. The story exploded like a bomb, sending shockwaves through the nation. Emily's article was everywhere, on news channels, social media, and the front pages of every major newspaper. The details were damning: Colonel Harris's ties to Blackwater security, the unlawful orders, the civilians caught in the crossfire. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. Protests erupted outside military bases, hashtags trended worldwide, and politicians demanded answers. But for James, the fallout was personal. Almost overnight, he became a polarizing figure. To some, he was a hero, a soldier who'd risked everything to expose the truth. To others, he was a traitor, a man who'd betrayed his country and his comrades. The base was divided. Some soldiers avoided him, their eyes filled with suspicion. Others quietly thanked him, their voices hushed but sincere. James tried to focus on the support, but the hostility was hard to ignore. The harassment started soon after the story broke. Anonymous messages flooded his phone, calling him every name in the book. His social media accounts were hacked, his personal information leaked online. One night he found his locker vandalized, the words "traitor" scrawled across the door in red paint. James cleaned it up without a word, but the message was clear. He was a target now, and the attacks were only going to get worse. Sarah was his rock through it all. She stood by him, her loyalty unwavering even as the pressure mounted. "They're scared," she told him one evening as they sat in the barracks after another long day. "Scared of what this means for them, scared of the truth, but that doesn't mean you're wrong." James nodded, grateful for her support, but he couldn't shake the guilt. "I never wanted to drag you into this," he said. Sarah smiled faintly. "You didn't," she replied. "I chose to be here, and I'd choose it again." The military's response was swift but predictable. A formal investigation was launched, but James knew it was just for show. Harris had too many friends in high places, too much influence to let this go easily. The hearings were a farce, with Harris denying everything and painting James as a disgruntled soldier with an axe to grind. The evidence was strong, but the system was rigged. Then came the leaks. Classified documents began appearing online, detailing Blackwater's contracts and Harris's involvement. The public's anger grew, but so did the backlash. James was accused of being the source, of endangering national security by releasing sensitive information. He denied it, but the damage was done. His credibility was under attack, and the narrative was shifting. One evening, as James sat in the barracks, his phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "We need to talk," it read. "Meet me at the usual spot." James's heart raced. He'd been lying low, avoiding contact with her to protect them both. But if she was reaching out, it had to be important. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Emily looked tired but determined. "Things are getting worse," she said, her voice low. "Harris is pulling out all the stops to discredit us, and he's not working alone." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily leaned in closer. "There's someone else," she said. "Someone higher up. They're covering for him, trying to bury the story." James felt a chill run down his spine. He'd always suspected there was more to this, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "What do we do?" he asked. Emily sighed. "We keep fighting," she said, "but we need to be smart. Harris is desperate, and desperate people do desperate things." The warning came too late. The next morning, James was summoned to the base commander's office. He walked in, his heart pounding, unsure of what to expect. But what he found wasn't an enemy, it was an ally. Captain David Reynolds, a high-ranking officer with a reputation for integrity, was waiting for him. "Carter," Reynolds said, his voice firm but kind, "I've been following your case, and I want you to know you're not alone." James felt a surge of hope. "What happens now?" he asked. Reynolds smiled. "Now," he said, "we fight back." As James left the office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a chance. The truth was out there, and he was ready to fight for it. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras trained on the center of the room where James sat, his uniform crisp and his expression unreadable. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading and preparing for. The court-martial was underway, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Colonel Harris sat across the room, his face a mask of cold confidence. He'd spent weeks painting James as a rogue soldier, a man who'd betrayed his country for personal glory. The prosecution's case was strong, their arguments polished and relentless. They called witnesses, fellow soldiers, officers, even a psychologist, all of whom testified to James's supposed instability and disregard for authority. James listened in silence, his hands clenched in his lap. He knew this was just the beginning. The real battle would come when it was his turn to speak. But first, he had to survive the prosecution's onslaught. The turning point came on the third day of the trial. Emily Torres took the stand, her presence commanding the room's attention. She laid out the evidence piece by piece: the mission files, the Blackwater contracts, the whistleblower testimony. Her voice was steady, her words precise. But the prosecution wasn't going down without a fight. "Ms. Torres," the lead prosecutor said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "isn't it true that your sources are unreliable, that your so-called evidence is based on hearsay and conjecture?" Emily didn't flinch. "No," she said firmly. "My sources are credible, and the evidence speaks for itself. Colonel Harris orchestrated unlawful missions for personal gain, and Sergeant Carter had the courage to expose it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the judge banging his gavel for order. James felt a flicker of hope, but it was short-lived. The prosecution called their final witness, a high-ranking official from the Department of Defense. His testimony was damning, his words carefully crafted to undermine everything Emily had said. By the time he stepped down, the mood in the room had shifted. Then it was James's turn. He took the stand, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. The defense attorney began with a simple question: "Sergeant Carter, why did you refuse Colonel Harris's order?" James took a deep breath. "Because it was wrong," he said. "It violated every principle I swore to uphold. I joined the military to protect people, not to harm them." The attorney nodded, leading James through his testimony. He spoke of the mission file, the lack of evidence, the civilians who would have been caught in the crossfire. He spoke of his conversations with Emily, the evidence they'd uncovered, the corruption they'd exposed. And he spoke of his decision to come forward, knowing the risks but believing it was the right thing to do. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. They questioned his motives, his judgment, even his loyalty. But James held his ground, his answers firm and unwavering. "I stand by my decision," he said finally, "not because it was easy, but because it was right." The trial stretched on for days, each side presenting their case with fierce determination. But the real bombshell came on the final day, when the defense called a surprise witness: Captain David Reynolds. Reynolds took the stand, his presence commanding immediate respect. He spoke of his own investigations into Harris's activities, of the evidence he'd gathered over the years. And then he dropped the bombshell: a recording of a conversation between Harris and a Blackwater executive, discussing the unlawful missions in chilling detail. The courtroom was silent as the recording played, Harris's voice cold and calculating. When it ended, the room erupted in chaos. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The verdict came quickly after that. James was acquitted of all charges, the court ruling that his refusal to follow the unlawful order was not only justified but commendable. Harris, on the other hand, was arrested on the spot, his career and reputation in ruins. As James left the courtroom, he was met with a mix of cheers and silence. Some hailed him as a hero, others glared at him with open hostility. But James didn't care. He'd done what he set out to do. He stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Sarah was waiting for him outside, her smile brighter than the sun. "You did it," she said, pulling him into a hug. James hugged her back, a sense of relief washing over him. "We did it," he corrected. But as they walked away, James knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice was far from over, but for now he allowed himself a moment of peace. The truth had won, and that was enough. The days and weeks that followed the trial were a whirlwind of change. James's acquittal had sent shockwaves through the military, sparking a wave of reforms and investigations. Colonel Harris's arrest was just the beginning. High-ranking officials were scrutinized, contracts with private military contractors were canceled, and new protocols were put in place to prevent similar abuses of power. The system was far from perfect, but it was a start. For James, life after the trial was a mix of relief and uncertainty. He was honorably discharged from the military, his record cleared of all charges, but the cost of his decision was still fresh in his mind. He'd lost his career, his sense of purpose, and in some ways his identity. Yet he didn't regret it, not for a moment. The public's reaction was mixed. To many, James was a hero, a symbol of courage and integrity in the face of corruption. He received letters of support from strangers, invitations to speak at events, and even a few job offers. But not everyone saw him that way. To some, he was still a traitor, a man who'd betrayed his country and his comrades. The hostility was hard to ignore, but James tried to focus on the positive. One of the most unexpected outcomes was the bond he'd formed with Emily Torres. Their partnership had started out of necessity, but it had grown into a genuine friendship. Emily continued to report on the fallout from the trial, her articles keeping the pressure on those in power. "This isn't over," she told James one evening over coffee. "There's still a lot of work to do, but we've made a difference, and that's something." James nodded, grateful for her support, but he knew he couldn't rely on her forever. He needed to find his own path, his own way to make a difference. That's when the idea came to him. One morning, James sat down at his kitchen table, a blank notebook in front of him. He began to write about his experiences, his struggles, his hopes for the future. The words flowed easily as if they'd been waiting to come out. By the end of the week, he had a plan. James decided to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and advocating for military reform. He called it Courage First, a name that reflected his belief in doing what's right, no matter the cost. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and James found himself at the center of a movement he'd never expected to lead. But the real turning point came when James received a letter from a young soldier stationed overseas. The soldier had read about James's story and felt inspired to speak out about the abuses he'd witnessed. "You showed me that it's possible to stand up for what's right," the letter read, "even when it feels like the whole world is against you." James read the letter over and over, tears welling in his eyes. This was why he'd done it. This was what made it all worth it. As the months passed, James's life began to take on a new rhythm. He spent his days working on Courage First, his evenings writing, and his weekends reconnecting with the people he cared about. Sarah was a constant presence, her support unwavering. Emily became a trusted advisor, her sharp mind and fearless spirit guiding the organization's efforts. And James, he found a new sense of purpose, one that felt just as meaningful as his time in the military. But the scars of the past never fully faded. There were nights when James lay awake, haunted by the choices he'd made and the lives he'd touched. There were days when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. But he kept going, one step at a time, because he knew he had to. One evening, as James stood on the balcony of his small apartment watching the sunset, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for it. He'd faced the worst and come out stronger on the other side. And he knew, deep down, that he'd do it all over again if he had to. Because in the end, it wasn't about the medals or the accolades. It was about doing what was right. And that was a battle worth fighting. As the sun sets on this chapter of James Carter's life, we're left with a powerful reminder. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act in spite of it. James's story is one of integrity, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that doing what's right is always worth it, no matter the cost. His journey wasn't easy. He faced betrayal, hostility, and the weight of impossible choices. But through it all, he held onto the values that defined him: honor, justice, and the courage to stand up for what he believed in. And in doing so, he inspired countless others to do the same. James's story is a testament to the power of one voice, one decision to spark change. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we have the power to make a difference. But it's also a call to action, a challenge to each of us to examine our own lives and ask, what would we do in James's shoes? Would we have the courage to stand up, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous? As we close this chapter, let's carry James's story with us. Let's remember that change begins with a single step, a single voice, a single act of courage. And let's ask ourselves, what can we do to make the world a little better, a little fairer, a little kinder? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If James's story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done in his situation. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, resilience, and the power of doing what's right. Because in the end, it's not about the battles we win or the recognition we receive. It's about the choices we make and the legacy we leave behind.